The chalk dust hung in the afternoon light like a held breath the moment Professor Whitfield decided to humiliate someone for sport. And nobody in that lecture hall could have guessed that the woman with the mop bucket by the door was about to rewrite everything they thought they knew about genius. It was a Tuesday afternoon at Kingsbridge University, the kind of golden autumn day when sunlight poured through tall windows and lit up dust motes drifting over rows of restless engineering students. Professor Elliot Whitfield stood at the front of Lecture Hall C, chalk in hand, a smug curl at the corner of his mouth as he surveyed the equation sprawled across the blackboard behind him. It was a monstrous thing, a tangle of differential terms and matrix notations that had taken him 20 minutes to write, designed specifically to stump even his brightest doctoral candidates. He had built his entire reputation on being the hardest professor in the department, the one who made grown men weep during office hours, and today he was in a particularly theatrical mood. That was when Margarite Colson pushed her cleaning cart through the side door, exactly as she did every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, her rubber-soled shoes silent against the tile, her gray uniform pressed and neat, despite the long hours she'd already put in that day. She was 53 years old, with silver threading through tightly coiled hair she kept pinned beneath a faded blue kerchief, and she had been cleaning the halls of Kingsbridge for 11 years. Most professors didn't look at her twice. Most students didn't either. She had learned to move through those marble corridors like a ghost, invisible, unremarkable, present only in the gleam of the floors she left behind her. Professor Whitfield, however, noticed her that day, and something cruel sparked behind his eyes. He had an audience of 30 students who adored him, or feared him enough to laugh at whatever he found funny, and he saw in Margarite an opportunity for a cheap laugh before the exam. Season made everyone miserable. He raised his chalk-dusted hand and called out to her, his voice dripping with false politeness, asking if she wouldn't mind trying. Her hand at the equation, on the board since she was already in the room. A ripple of laughter moved through the students immediately, some uncomfortable, most simply amused, the kind of laughter that comes easily when you've never once considered that the person in the uniform might have a story you know nothing about. Margarite paused with her hand on the cart handle. She had heard remarks like this before, the kind wrapped in a smile but sharpened underneath, and for 11 years she had simply lowered her eyes and kept moving, because a paycheck mattered more than pride, and because she had 2 grandchildren, counting on the money she sent home every month. But something in her that afternoon, some old ember she hadn't touched in decades, stirred awake. She looked at the board. She looked at the equation. And for the first time in a very long time, Margarite Colson allowed herself to remember who she used to be before life had rerouted her so completely. Before you find out what happened next, if you believe that kindness deserves a second chance, and that people are never quite who we assume them to be, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Whispering Tales Stories so you never miss a story like this one. What none of the 30 students in that room knew, what Professor Whitfield himself had never bothered to ask, was that Margarite Colson had once been on track to become one of the most promising mathematicians of her generation. 28 years earlier, she had been Marguerite Ashworth, a scholarship student at a prestigious university 2 states away, the first in her family to attend college, filling notebooks with proofs that made her own professors sit up straighter. She had dreamed of teaching one day, of standing at a chalkboard just like this one and opening young minds to the quiet beauty of numbers. But in her final year, her mother fell gravely ill, and then her father lost his factory job, and the scholarship money that covered tuition did nothing to cover rent or medicine or the mounting bills that swallowed her family whole. She withdrew from school 3 credits short of her degree to work 2 jobs and keep her parents afloat, always telling herself it was temporary, always believing she would go back. Then her husband, a kind but struggling man named Desmond, was injured in a warehouse accident, and the years folded one into another, and the dream she had carried so carefully simply had nowhere left to live. She never once complained. She raised 2 children who became a nurse and a school teacher, and she found quiet dignity in every honest day of work. But the part of her that had once solved equations for pure joy had gone dormant, tucked away like an old photograph in a drawer. Nobody opened anymore. Margarite walked to the front of the hole, and the laughter died down into an uncertain murmur as she picked up a piece of chalk. Professor Whitfield's smirk faltered slightly, though he folded his arms and leaned against his desk, still certain this was going to end exactly as he'd planned. With an awkward silence and a lesson about staying in one's lane, Marguerite studied the equation for perhaps 10 seconds, her eyes moving across the terms the way a musician reads a familiar score, and then her hand began to move. She wrote quickly, cleanly, her handwriting precise and unhurried, each step following the last with a fluency that silenced every whisper in the room. Students leaned forward in their seats. Someone in the back row stopped chewing gum mid-motion. The scratch of chalk against slate became the only sound in Lecture Hall C, steady and rhythmic like a heartbeat. In just under 3 minutes, Marguerite set down the chalk, stepped back, and looked at Professor Whitfield with an expression that held no triumph and no anger, only a quiet, tired calm. The equation was solved completely and correctly, every step elegant, every simplification exactly the shortcut a true mathematician would have taken. For a long moment, nobody moved. Professor Whitfield stared at the board, his face draining of its earlier smugness, his mind scrambling to find an explanation that would let him keep his footing in front of the class he had spent years cultivating as an audience for his own brilliance. He asked her almost involuntarily where she had learned to do that, and his voice had lost every trace of mockery. Marguerite told him plainly that she had once studied mathematics, that she had been 3 credits from a degree before life, asked something different of her, and that solving equations used to be the thing that made her feel most like herself. She said it without bitterness, the way someone describes an old friend they haven't seen in years but still think of fondly. The room was utterly silent now, 30 young students staring at the woman they had laughed at only minutes before, seeing her perhaps for the first time, as a whole person with a history far richer than the uniform she wore. A young woman in the front row, a doctoral student named Priya Anand who had been nervously preparing to present her own thesis defense that same week, felt something crack open in her chest, a mixture of shame and awe she would carry with her for a long time afterward. Word of what happened in lecture Hall C spread through the university, faster than anyone could have predicted, not because anyone meant to make a spectacle of it, but because decency has a way of traveling further than cruelty ever does. Within days, the dean of the mathematics department, a thoughtful woman named Dr. Solange Fairweather, asked to meet with Marguerite personally. She had heard the story from 3 different students independently, and she wanted to know more about the credits. Marguerite still needed to finish her degree. What followed was not a fairy tale rescue, but something steadier and more real. A conversation about transfer credits and evening classes, about a possible teaching assistantship, about a path that had been quietly waiting for Marguerite to walk back onto it whenever she found the courage. Marguerite did not quit her cleaning job overnight, because bills do not disappear because of one remarkable afternoon, but she began taking 2 classes a semester, her old notebooks pulled from storage, her handwriting on those pages slowly filling with the same confident strokes she had used on that chalkboard. Professor Whitfield never forgot that day either. He requested a private meeting with Marguerite weeks later, not to save face publicly, but simply because something in him had shifted and he wanted to apologize properly, human to human, away from any audience. He admitted that he had spent so many years performing intelligence for a room full of students that he had forgotten what real intelligence actually looked like, that it rarely announces itself, that it often wears a uniform nobody bothers to look at twice. Marguerite accepted his apology with the same quiet grace she carried through everything else, and in an unexpected turn, he became one of her strongest advocates, personally recommending her for a research assistant position the following year. If this story touched something in you today, if it reminded you that the people we overlook are often carrying entire universes inside them, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it, because stories like Marguerite's deserve to travel further than any of us can imagine. Before we close this chapter, if you feel that this story deserves to be remembered, type the word chalkboard in the comments below, so we know this story reached exactly the heart it was meant to find. 2 years after that Tuesday afternoon in Lecture Hall C, Marguerite Coulson walked across a stage in a cap and gown, 3 credits and 2 decades later than she had once planned, to finally receive the degree she had earned twice over. Somewhere in the audience, Professor Whitfield stood and clapped louder than anyone else in the room, and Dr. Fairweather had already begun drafting the paperwork for her first official teaching position. a mathematics class scheduled for the following spring in the very same lecture hall where a mop bucket had once stood by the door. Marguerite still kept that old chalk-stained kerchief in a drawer at home, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder that dignity had never once depended on anyone else's permission to see it, and that sometimes the quietest people in the room are carrying the loudest kind of brilliance, simply waiting for the world to finally ask the right question.